Your book begins with a sobering account of the climatic and economic conditions that characterize our existence in 2025. You give a ranging taxonomy of the cascading, interconnected phenomena that makes our current predicament not just catastrophic, but increasingly difficult in unprecedented ways. Could you introduce some of these factors?
Most accounts of the immediate future or climate change in general tend to set out like either two sorts of approaches. It's either a shopping list of impacts and things that may well happen in the future, or it's sort of Mad Max dystopian catastrophe, the end of the world, billions will die, all that sort of stuff. And where I wanted to start from with the book is to sort of take seriously the proposition that we're already within a changing climate. Now, to make a statement like that is to also sort of overgeneralize in the sense that some people have been living in many parts of the world already living with far more profound impacts than we have in the global north for years now. So obviously climate change is combined and uneven in its effects and impacts. But where I wanted to start in the book is to not start with a shopping list on the one hand of things that may come to pass, or to posit on the other hand an inevitable catastrophe. So I really wanted to start with the mundane banality of the unfolding climate crisis. I really wanted to focus in on what it would mean in terms of the possibilities for social and political life. And to that end, it was relatively easy to categorize the current conjuncture with two main tools. One is to look at the concept of cost. And one of the propositions of the book is that where most people encounter climate change, even if they don't realize it, is in terms of the cost of living crisis. And that the cost of living crisis is in a very real way a climate crisis. So on the one hand, I look at costs, and that's everything from the incremental operating costs of coal-fired power stations due to climate change, food costs, just the wear and tear in terms of different pieces of infrastructure, but also sort of the incremental costs to services, to provision of the social wage, as well as the costs to our own physical and mental health. So the idea is that there's this steady erosion of our material, social, and psychological wealth on the one hand. The second one is in terms of the concept of disruption. And I wanted to reclaim that in some senses from this sort of Mad Max sort of vision of disruption as catastrophe. Whereas disruption, the way that most of us encounter it, is far more mundane. It's less the flood and it's more the pothole. It's all the small disruptions to everyday life that lead to broken axles, punctured tires. It could be the cancelled train. It could be the disruption to the service. It could be the out of stock sign on the shelf. It's those that sort of then mount over time. And when you put the two together, you also get a less appreciated element of this sort of squeeze on our living standards. You get an increased cost to government in terms of repairing or restoring services and functions and dealing with the increasing costs of environmental defense, infrastructure maintenance, all the rest of it, that then reduces the amount available for other service provisions. So we have a squeeze on the social wage. Now, between those two, we end up with what I call the climate squeeze, which is not just a pressure on everyday life in terms of mounting costs and reduced expenditure on anything other that's it's not a core sort of spend. It also reduces what we can imagine as the possible. So when you have less money, when you're less certain of things that are going to happen, when you find it more difficult to plan for the future, and in particular, when you can only see this cost increasing over time as climate change itself escalates, the horizon of what's possible shrinks, it contracts. It also shrinks the space available for politics. Most political practices are not heavily intertwined with all of the usual functions of social and economic life. It's this additional thing that you do, or this additional thing that you undertake either in your workplace, your community, through a party, through an environmental organization. But that requires the social space and the personal space and resources to engage in political practices. Politics has always been unequally distributed. It's gendered, racialized, classed in terms of who has the resources to participate or even the ability to participate or the skill and experience that enables you to participate and the material available in terms of your life resources to undertake political activity, which is why sort of, where I live out in the countryside, for instance, Most of volunteering is done by people who've retired and who are quite economically comfortable. So there's a stratification. The squeeze reduces the space available to all of us to undertake political action, and it then further intensifies the inequity of political activism and political action. The shrinking of political horizons, the retreat of the space of politics are all quite core to outlining how the squeeze then shapes how we're going to have to organize through the transition itself.
A central contribution of the book is to bring us face to face with what the work of green transitions actually looks like for workers in countries such as those in Europe and in the US. This reality is part of the reason why you argue for an ambiguous relationship to the dominant form in which sustainable transitions are being carried out. What does green transition work look like, and why does it matter?
The transition itself was sold, and I think this is one of Joe Biden's lines, it was sold as meaning jobs. And it didn't mean just any kinds of jobs. The whole narrative of the Green New Deal or the European Green Deal or the Inflation Reduction Act or any of the various policies that, in some senses, the environment movement still wants to treat as a poor imitation of our ideal form, which is the Green New Deal. All of these were supposed to deliver jobs. And there's two aspects to that. The first is that these jobs weren't just any kinds of jobs. For the most part, it was meant to be the well-paid, well-organized, unionized work of making things. Now, either be that infrastructure, but for the most part, the images that were circulating, also the rhetoric that was circulating, was around manufacturing. And on the one hand, we have that. On the other hand, there's a sort of implicit rationale behind why there was an emphasis on manufacturing, and that was to restore economic growth. Most of the various propositions around transition economics, or the various policies and legislation that's put in place, came into place after 2008. And they were very much seen as a marriage between various kinds of industrial policy or market creating policies, so legislating for people to transition to electric vehicles or to buy heat pumps, in essence, creating markets where they previously didn't exist. It was meant to be an effort to generate new industries and new opportunities and new avenues for investment in an era that was largely marked by what we could call economic stagnation, or more broadly, this concept that became popular once again after 2008 of the idea of secular stagnation. So we had two things. We had this problem of economic growth that investment was supposed to solve, and this real emphasis on industry. Now, what's turned out to be the case is that while a series of policies have been put in place to encourage private investment, to de-risk investment and new industries, to create new markets, to guarantee profits through various mechanisms, that hasn't led to a green industrial revival in the global north. Now, this is not to say there isn't green industry. It is to say that in terms of solving the problem of economic stagnation and creating new industry, the transition hasn't worked. If anything, the move to greening industry has deepened the existing problems of deindustrialization in the north and conversely overcapacity in the remaining industries in the north in competition with the world's sole manufacturing superpower, China. So one of the reasons to focus on industry was to generate manufacturing jobs, and this is how the green transition was sold. Now, it was sold largely as a story of men telling other men they're going to produce particular kinds of masculine encoded work. So the sense of betrayal when those jobs haven't turned up is felt most of all by men in those areas already suffering from deindustrialization that are quickly becoming reform heartlands in England and mega heartlands in the US. The book sets out how sort of the first thing that the transition's produced in its in terms of its political economy is a series of betrayed promises around the revival of manufacturing. That's quite different and stands in strong contrast to the sorts of work it actually has generated in the global north. Now, again, as with deindustrialization, it's intensified an existing trend towards a deeper service economy and a shift of the balance of the economy towards small and medium-sized enterprises. For the most part, the transition economy in a country like the UK is an installation economy. It's an economy organized through small and medium-sized businesses, overwhelmingly service provision work, where small businesses install things manufactured somewhere else and then service those installations. So Heat pumps and solar panels are a quintessential example, but we could be dealing with offshore wind farms, even dealing with aspects of sort of smart grids, smart meters, IT services. And that's part of a more general tendency towards assembly as the sort of the core activity of what's left of things that we would used to be able to regard as manufacturing in the global north. Now, there's a few issues with that in terms of the promises of the jobs made. It doesn't, there's a different geography, different sets of conditions. Many of these small businesses are actually far more precarious than the broader small business sector in the UK. So we're dealing with smaller, more fragmented workplaces, harder to organize, and often the work is a little bit more precarious. On the other hand, that sort of work doesn't have the same sort of multiplier effect that industry does. It doesn't generate as many jobs indirectly through the rest of the economy. So as well as not delivering on industry, the transition economy is, broadly speaking, not delivering on jobs in general, despite the fact that it's a fast growing sector. Now, there are other parts to the story. There are two sort of we could call green industries that are largely overlooked in terms of job delivery. One is waste processing, which is a huge green industry. It's a central part of the creation of a circular economy and the transition to a net zero economy is waste collecting and sorting, which is very low skilled, low wage, lots of migrant labor, lots of exploitation. And the other one, the other sort of main industry is guard work around construction sites, protest sites, mine sites. It's the sort of, I guess we could even go a little bit further here and look at border protection as a green industry in terms of the future. So guard work, waste collection, installing things. These are the three actual green sectors that are being developed as a part of the transition, not industry. And this has some deep consequences in terms of how people understand what green work is. And I only just came back from Scotland last week, and one of the things that's really quite clear is that on the ground in Scotland, there's a very strong narrative, particularly in impacted workplaces, that the transition it's not so much a lie, but is a deep and profound betrayal. And there's really only two options instances. The first instance is to either reject it wholesale, to go on the defensive, or to somehow contest, or find a way to contest the actual rollout of what is, by and large, a service economy that's often nowhere near where previous industry jobs used to exist.
Your book zones in on community-led action as a fruitful direction for activism in this context, without wanting to withdraw from workplace organising altogether. Can you say more about whole worker approaches and why they are essential in a world of transition?
One of the problems with the transition economy that we have is that it's a set of betrayed promises, a greening of deindustrialization, and sort of a further fragmentation of a green workforce. We face some real challenges in terms of organizing. Now, it's tempting to sort of seed the ground of the workplace as a site of resistance. Most of the time, we either see celebrations of unions uncritically, or we see a leaning into sort of government policy sort of at a national level is the only possible way of affecting change. Workplaces are a core site of struggle and of contestation, but then we have some real problems in terms of what the transition constitutes. One of the things that happens is that we tend to get stuck in defensive struggles in the most affected industries. So, for example, Port Talbot in Wales, when we look at the steel mill, that steel mill alone produced 1.5% of the UK's carbon emissions. It was faced with so much international competition and high energy costs that it was uncompetitive and was reportedly losing vast amounts of money each year. It was presented with a choice. The owners presented the government with a choice. It's either part fund its transition to a greener form of production and protect some jobs, or we close the mill in its entirety. Now, that's the sort of choice that gets presented to most industry, even green industry now. I'm thinking about Nissan in Sunderland, for example, all the time. And then within a global economy characterized by stagnation and a greening of stagnation now, that's the sort of choice that will recur again and again and again. If we focus on a defensive approach, we end up with either sort of acquiescing to what ended up being the loss of two and a half thousand jobs out of a workforce of 4,000 and for a greener sort of production model. Or we produce something like Unite's response in that instance, which was to lean into not only keeping the coal-fired blast furnaces operating, but then demanding further government investment in other green industries that also would have been internationally uncompetitive. It's a kind of counter planning. It's a suggestion from Unite that what could be done differently, but it's done without any sort of anchoring in the reality of the transition, or even in what would be considered local demands in terms of what sort of jobs did people want in their region? What do they actually want their region to produce? What are the needs of Port Talbot? It's also worth noting that Port Talbot produces for export by and large. The UK, at the height of steel industry in the UK, we consumed almost 70% of the steel we produced, whereas now we export all but 12 to 13%. So we've moved to having to compete internationally to make steel. Now, one of the ways that you tended to organize, particularly defensively, is you take James McAvey's whole worker organizing approach. The traditional way that's undertaken is that you consider workers to be not just located in a workplace or a factory or a mill or something like that, but part of a broader community. And you call on their linkages to the broader community, their church, their social groups, their football club, their parents' association for the school that their children attend, and you draw on those resources to build a broader campaign to defend the workplace. Now, this is a tried and tested model. It can be very effective. It delivers very strong and powerful wins. Part of the problem with the way that it exists at the moment, though, is it's still registered as a defensive struggle. And if the mill's unprofitable, and even if the government took it over, and we're looking at this with British Steel, it's still going to be unprofitable, even if it's nationalised. And if there's limited demand within Britain for that steel produced in those mills, then the defensive struggle is not going to save all of the jobs. There's very little scope there to do something different. One of the ways we can get past that is to sort of think about, well, what could we do differently? What should we be doing differently? Because in many instances, what we're talking about, what we need to do to transition differently is to plan a different kind of economy. So it's economic planning, but it needs to take a different form. We can't just produce pie-in-the-sky shopping lists or blueprints for when we eventually seize the reins of government. We can invert the workplace in this instance. We could ask, well, given the resources that we have, what would the community want the workplace to do? What does the community actually need in that instance? What if we did, rather than whole worker organizing, we did whole community organizing? What if we mobilized people not in a defensive struggle for a workplace, but rather mobilized people around the community's immediate needs? Now, that would mean that we shift the locus of planning on focusing on defensive counter planning for that particular factory or mill to counter planning for the whole community. One of the ways I imagine a different vision for organizing is around the communities as not just sites of struggle, but as sites of counter planning around community needs, particularly making use of anchor institutions such as public services, hospitals, large employers like that, and the levers of municipal government. Community can be quite a powerful source for planning something different and organizing across a number of different workplaces, which is what we need to do if we want to get past the defensive struggles around our last remaining industries. It also then would enable us to engage with those smaller businesses and medium-sized enterprises that actually characterize the transition economy.
Your book makes an excellent point that within an economically and materially constrained world comes a correlating constraint on our imaginations and on hope itself, in fact. But you also point to an entanglement between refusal and hope. How does that dynamic work in your view?
Part of the problem with most articulations of climate politics is that you read in articles that set out the litany of problems that we face, or whole books sort of describing the horrors that are to come or are already here on our doorstep. And you usually end it with a chapter or two of policy, or on the other hand, sort of prescriptions of some sort of fantastical savior that will step in at the last moment, like the working class, undifferentiated, or unions in an unproblematic format, or even individual action, some sort of individual heroic action. In the end, there's a real sense of magic or fantasy in most prescriptions for climate action. And I think possibly the worst come down to these prescriptions for government when we finally, the left, the environment movement, progressives, more generally, finally take control of government, or at the very least, we sort of gain the ear of politicians and speak reason to them. So then they finally wake up. One of the reasons I think refusal is so crucial is to open up space for everyday politics, to carve out some of the material grounds for that, find a way to contest the cost of living, to contest the construction of the social wage, to push back on the disruptions or the processes of abandonment underway for many of us, being relegated to everything from flood risk ghettos to the retreat of essential services, changing designations around what constitutes flood risk or adequate compensation. So I think refusal in the first instance is a pushing back to create some space to enable us to make politics. In the second instance of refusal that I think is quite crucial comes back to the point around counter planning. We can't leave the plans that we have for the future to other people, in the sense that our immediate needs and our desires for the future have to be anchored in an actual political dialogue at a community, workplace, local level. Refusal in that instance is a refusal of the choice being presented to us, either their transition or no transition at all. So in both instances, one, we refuse to create space, and the second one, we refuse to leave the plan to somebody else. I think the combination of those two begins to articulate a life beyond mere survival, which in some ways it feels like what we're being asked to adopt is just a mere survival as an approach. Just pay for the essentials, just get by, just sort of take whatever work we can get hold of. If we're going to get hold of it at all, sort of increasingly feel abandoned by local governments, national governments, insurance companies, landlords. To refuse abandonment is in many ways like a quite profoundly radical act. And it also then enables us to start making demands. So in that instance, I think refusal is necessary for hope, because it's only through refusal that we then start to articulate a more forceful, aggressive agenda, where we make demands on providers, businesses, the state, in all of its various forms, but do so not in a defensive posture, but one where we assert what we want to actually have. It doesn't absolve us of difficult choices. There will always be difficult choices, but they're made with us, not about us.